It's class number 4. Class number 4. Let's get the YouTube stream started so people can rewatch it later. Looks like we're good. Do a quick audio test. See if I can hear things. I also realize I don't have the right mic right now.
Okay. I think it was my sound was working before. Just I think it was my computer mic. Now I have it on my ear pods. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. All right. Let's get started. Okay. All right, so we're going to continue right where we left off yesterday. We are working on building a little personal website that some nice stuff happening. So I'm going to share my screen. This screen. And I have a nice empty screen here, starting right from scratch again. You should already have VS Code downloaded if you're following along, because otherwise, yesterday you probably wouldn't have got much done. Feel free, obviously, to follow along. I'm going to be trying to go at a good pace, but in the case that you get held up on something, hit up us on the chat. Otherwise, feel free also not to follow along and just kind of take it in. This is also being broadcast on YouTube, so you can rewatch it later at your own pace if you got stuck on something. So what I'm going to do is open VS Code. There's just many ways to open that depending on where you have it. But the most basic way would be going to my applications folder on my Mac and looking for VS Code and opening it. And it will come open. It may automatically just open up in the last project that you were in which case you're probably good to go. You can check that by going here and you should see some files. I do not have it set that way. So I'm going to go File, Open. And I need to navigate to wherever I was making those projects before. So I have put it in here. And basically, I want to open the folder that contains my index.html as well as the other files. So I'm just going to click Open. I'll do a little refresh, and we'll see on the sidebar, which I'm going to zoom, that I can see my files. I can open up a file simply by clicking on it, and everything is good. So I have my code here. I am going to just close this guy here to make space. I'm also going to half this so that I can open up my website on this side of the screen. So to preview my website that I've been making, I'm going to open this guy again, and I'm going to right click on my index.html, and I'm going to go Reveal in Finder. That'll just open up that file in Finder. And then if I just double click on my index.html, it'll be here. So now I have both things open so that if I do make a change, such as putting a bunch of exclamation marks here and save and refresh. So on a Mac, Command S, and then click over here, Command R. That's the easiest way to do it. We can see that we are, in fact, working on the right one. Okay, so we'll do a quick review of what we built. So on the HTML side of things, we created our simple HTML opening and closing tag. We have a head that has our title, and that's not this title, but the title that shows up in the tab bar. And I can demonstrate that by putting an exclamation mark there and seeing, look, there it's changed. It didn't change this one. That's different. We also included 2 files, reset.css and a style.css. The reset was basically this file we copy and pasted just by searching for CSS reset and clicking on this Meyer web one, and essentially pasting all this into a file that we called reset.css. Paste in there, saved, and included it. And all this file does is kind of level the playing field. Browsers all have different defaults for font sizes and for H1 boldness and margins and all these kind of things that can be really get really complicated when you're working on a website that you want to run in multiple browsers, which should always be the goal. So this kind of just levels the playing field. Then we also created a new file called style.css and included it this way, like here in the head, and put some CSS here, which we'll look at in a minute. And then within our body, we made a container called header. That way we could style it, and we did some things with CSS. We gave it a title of Tyler's website. I'm sure you probably used a different title than that. And then we have a menu that's has a few links in it, like this. And that's pretty much where we got to on the HTML. And what I'm going to do is open my style.css, and I'm actually going to split these. I generally like to split right. I find it's the easiest way to kind of compare things, but for the purpose of the stream, I'm going to split down. That way I can have two files at the same time, and we can all see them. Yeah, and we went through and we made a few style declarations. So we wanted to style our header, and we did that by having a period, which denotes like look for a class with the name header. Class equals header. Okay, we found it. And we gave it a background color. We gave it some padding. That's what gives it that little bit of space, top and bottom. We gave it a border bottom. That's that little line here. It might be hard to see on the stream, but there is in fact a 2-pixel, slightly darker purple line. We styled the H1 by saying header space H1. And what that space means is it's going to look for any H1s within a header. We said let's give it a font size of 32 pixels, make it font weight of bold, give it a font fat, got a font family of monospace, and so on and so forth. We also styled the menu, telling it we want it to be centered text, and we gave it a bit of margin so it wasn't like touching this. And we styled each link. This is probably the most fun part because it looks so pretty. I'm not a designer, but I know you would think otherwise because this site looks so good. Yeah, we gave it some background color, we gave it some padding around each of the A items, essentially making them kind of look like buttons. They're buttons. And what we did is we added a pseudo class to those A's. So essentially we added a :hover, no spaces, just :hover, and that allowed us to have basically say style it differently whenever someone is hovering it. And there you go. And we added a little bit of extra love by saying we want the background color actually transition anytime a change happens. And that's why it kind of does this quick fade. So that's basically where we got to. We're going to continue off now by kind of starting to style this section. We started some HTML, which was nice, and we're going to make it look prettier. So the first thing I want to do, we'll keep this for now, but we're actually going to start by creating a container for our content. And I'm going to do that by making a div, with a class of, and I'm going to call it content. And give some space here. And I'm just going to cut these. So Command X and paste these like this. And save and refresh. No difference, but we now have it in a bit of a container here. So we're going to go to the CSS. And I'm going to go down a couple lines and say content. And basically for my content, I want to give it a bit of padding. Because I don't want it, touching the header. I also don't want it touching the side here. So let's give it a padding of, let's just use 12 pixels. And once we do that, we'll see, okay, there's a nice little bit of padding here. And this will, continue to extend. Now you may notice on certain websites, many have sort of this idea of a wrapper, meaning it kind of does this, but eventually it gets to a point where it hits a max width. we're going to do something like that too, because I find that is better for readability, because some people have big screens, and if you have to read by moving your head, it's not ideal. So what we're actually going to do, currently the width of this, because it's a div, is 100%. And we can prove that by looking here and seeing the actual content. And you can see it basically goes across the whole thing. It's saying it's 1279 wide. But if I was to make it a little bit bigger, that's going to change to 1443, 1443, and so on. I kind of think a max width of, I'm going to do a max width of 1,000. And we'll see how that looks. So now you'll kind of see that it's still going to be, you know, touching here, but the text starts to break and go down. So we're getting there. But generally a wrapper is centered so that the left side and the right side have the same amount of padding on the side. And the way we can do that is this nice little trick called margin left auto and margin right auto. So that'll essentially say, put the, help me, I want automatic margins on that. And if I have to refresh now, we'll see that that part stays in the middle. To show this a little bit better, I'm going to give it a temporary background color of red. That's my go-to color for debugging, just to kind of show the actual content of this box. Now it's really interesting because we never actually gave it a width. We gave it a max width. You're actually going to see that it gets smaller and smaller. It still will conform nicely. Ignore the image part, but the text itself is conforming to the width of the browser. It just eventually hits a point of 1,000 pixels and says, I don't want to be bigger than that. So that's nice. That's working good. So let's get rid of that background color. Okay, so we have content. Nice. I think that paragraph text could be nicer. So we're going to copy the word content, do a space, and take a P, write the letter P to target that paragraph. And let's give it a font size of 18 pixels. Cool. That's looking all right. In fact, because it's my home page, I think we can even go a bit bigger, 22 pixels. That looks nice. Let's do a few other things for, as well. I'm going to temporarily get rid of this image because it's kind of, I don't want to style the image yet. I want to focus on the text, and it's kind of distracting me. So I could just delete this, of course, and refresh, and it's gone. But then I might like forget, like, oh, what did I have there? I don't want to necessarily delete it. So I'm going to introduce you to something called comments. Commenting is super helpful. It's generally meant for leaving notes for yourself for the future or for another developer if you're collaborating with someone to kind of explain something. It's also really good for this case where we want to just temporarily remove something. Basically, a comment means it still stays in the code, but it's ignored by the browser. So to do an HTML comment, and it's every programming language has different commenting syntax, and I think the one for HTML is probably the most annoying looking one and tedious. Let me just remind myself. Yep. Okay, so wait. Yeah. Okay. So you essentially do a Pac-Man character, an exclamation mark, a space, dash, dash, dash. Nope, maybe no space. There we go. So you do that, and that's basically saying anything after this is a comment. And I want to say that's where the comment starts, but I also need to say where the comment ends. So I'm going to go dash, dash, that. So it's basically the same thing, but I think it's just, sorry, just 2 dashes is all you need. So I'm saying comment start by putting an exclamation mark, dash, dash, sorry, the Pac-Man character, great, what is that? Less than sign, exclamation mark, hyphen, hyphen, and then basically everything after that's a comment until the browser finds this. You'll see VS Code makes it green, and that's great. So if I was to refresh now, it's gone, but it's still in my code for future. I can easily get it back. So that's a comment in HTML. Now in CSS, comments are a little bit different. They are done with a / star, and then a star /. So I can still keep that code there and remember, oh yeah, I like that. But if I refresh, it's just going to go back to the default. So it can be a little bit annoying to remember comment syntax. So in VS Code, you can actually, let me see if you can do it with this. no, you can't. There's probably a good way to do it, but the way I do it is on a Mac, and it's Command and then /. So the kind of like the question where the question mark is on your keyboard. Doing that will toggle between comment and non-comment, and it works. You can highlight multiple lines and do it, and it will do it for you. And that's the same for HTML. You know, if I was to get rid of these and do Command/, it's going to turn on comments. Command/ turn it off. So I don't never need to try and remember, as long as my my code editor knows what language I'm using, it will help me by just remembering Command/. On Windows, I believe it's probably just Control/. Usually on VS Code, it's all the same mappings, just Control instead of Command. Boop, boop, boop. So yeah, we have our guy comment out here, so we can focus on this. Okay, let's go back to our paragraph here, so our content paragraph. And what we're going to do is, let's change this font, because I'm not really, I'm not loving the serif fonts. In fact, generally on web, you go with a sans serif font. Sans serif fonts are usually good for readability on a screen, whereas serif fonts are better for paper. So that's why newspapers are usually a serif font, and a lot of websites are sans serif. The difference being font style, or sorry, font family. I'm going to put it to serif, which is what it is right now. So you're not going to notice a change. That's a serif font. But if I type in sans serif, sans-serif, you'll see the difference. So it's a little bit, it doesn't have what are called serifs, which are basically those little like doohickeys, as I'll call them. These little like on the bottom of a P, for instance, that's what's called a serif in typography. So there we go. Okay, so we got that. That's nice. I think readability wise, I know it's not real text, so it's hard to have the real context, but I feel like the letters are kind of squished to get like the each line is kind of too tight with each other. So I can do something called line height. And generally you want to make your line height a bit bigger than your actual font size. So I'm going to make it maybe 28 pixels. And that's going to spread it out vertically. So all it's doing is kind of like adding a bit of padding between the, this line and this line, and so on and so forth. If I made that, really big, 100 pixels, it looks like that, as you expect. So there's basically, the way it's kind of working is 50 pixels are being added from the center of this W up, and 50 pixels are being added to the bottom. And then because this one has 50 being added and this one's 50, they get spread out by, there's essentially 100 pixels between the middle of the C and the middle of the C. That's what's happening under the hood. 28 feels good, but let's really spread it out. Good. Speaking of this kind of thing, I'll show you another tag or another property called letter spacing. We probably won't actually use this, but I'll demonstrate it. So letter spacing by default is 0 pixels, so no difference. But I'm going to make it something like 5 pixels to really demonstrate it. And that basically now adds letter spacing between each of the letters. So this is a nice effect to use in certain cases. I wouldn't recommend using it on actual like paragraph text. It's really hard to read because sometimes it's hard to tell where a word starts and where one doesn't. In fact, if you made it something like 12 pixels, I'm sure you would like, that looks like a word search now. So I'm going to turn that back off just by deleting that line. And we're good to go. Okay, what else might we want to do here? We might want to have, maybe this is a bit of an intro saying I'm this person, and then maybe I want to have a section of my site, and let's call it my hobbies. So I'm just going to make an H3 under this paragraph. And H3 is basically, this was an H1 that we styled. Generally, H1 is like your biggest and most important title, followed by an H2, which we actually don't have right now. But I feel like at some point we might add an H2 to denote what page we're on. Like this might say home. So I'm skipping H2 and going right to H3. And I'm calling it my hobbies. Now, because of our CSS reset, nothing special is happening to this. It's not bold, it's not big, but we do want to style it. So that's all good. What I want to do first, though, is I realize because of our reset, paragraphs also have, there's nothing happening with them special. And generally, you want space between your paragraphs. For example, let me copy this and pretend we had 2 paragraphs. other than the fact that it breaks to a new line, there's not really anything happening here to denote it's a new paragraph. So what I'm actually gonna do to my paragraph is give it a margin top of 8 pixels and a margin bottom of 8 pixels. And that'll essentially add a little bit of space between these things. I feel like we can probably double that. Cool. So we have a little bit of space, and that just by default, because we had a margin bottom, also made this this guy go down a bit too. So it's a little bit nicer. Okay, so let's style our H3. So I want to style, I could style, specifically H3s inside content, but I think I want to do that a little more globally because I might have H3s in other parts of my site, and I want to keep them, keep them consistent. So I'm actually just going to scroll up. I'm going to scroll right to my very top of this and make some space for kind of like some global elements. So for instance, H3s, I want to tell them, they do need a font weight of bold. They're going to have a font size of 18 pixels. And that will just style all H3s on my site, things like that. I'm also going to give it a font family. I'm going to do that mono font again, which is the same font we're using in here. Looks pretty good. Let's make it a little bit bigger, 22 pixels. And let's give it some color. Let's use the same color that essentially we're using here. I can look through my CSS to find that color. In fact, it's this color here. But if you're on another website and you're like, hey, I like that color, there's ways to get it. You, of course, can use a color picker. There's like extensions, browser extensions you can use, Mac apps you can use. You could screenshot this and bring it into Photoshop. But there's easier ways. So if I actually inspect my own website, and I can do this to anyone's website, right-click, inspect, and look at my H1, and I can go over here and see all the styles, and I can actually go and copy this. So I want to copy that hex code, which is the definition of its color. And if I refresh, we'll see that it looks like that. Cool. What else do we want to do with our H3s? I think our H3, because it's a new section, we can give it a, let's give it a border just on the bottom. So I'm going to say border dash bottom, and we're going to do a shorthand here of 2 pixels solid, and I'll use that same color. So, oops, make sure you don't have 2 hashtags, or you'll have an issue. So that made a border underneath it. The reason it's the full width is because H3s by default are just like divs, that they go full width. So in order for me to, if I wanted it to be less than that, I could style, instead of doing a border, I could use that text decoration that we did to unstyle our links. But I actually kind of like the look of this, so I'm going to keep it as is. Let's do a few more things to it. Let's give it a background color. And I'm going to take that same color that we're using here, which I'll just pull from here. And that looks all right. But now we're dealing with that issue of padding again. So let's think about our padding, and let's give it a padding of maybe 8 pixels. That might be too big. Oops, sorry, I put that in the wrong spot. Padding on the H3, 8 pixels. I think it could probably be a little bit smaller. Maybe let's go in the middle, 6 pixels. Great. I think that looks fine. We could, of course, decide to do a text align of center if we chose. But I'm personally happy with it just kind of being left, but do as you like. Great. So now we have a section. Now, what I would expect here, we could just put more text. Like I could just copy this line and paste in another paragraph and start talking about it. But I feel like this is a good opportunity to, just list my hobbies off. You don't have to read, don't read my whole paragraph, don't read my whole life story. Let's just have a list. So what we're going to do is make an unordered list. So we've seen this a few times. Unordered list, which is a UL. And then inside of it, we want to make list items. And I'm just going to call it hobby 1. And if I put that there, you'll see, okay, it's not anything pretty yet, but we're going to style it. So, and let's just put a couple more so it makes sense. So if we weren't using a CSS reset, this would already have bullets and stuff on it. But the CSS reset kills all those things, which is nice because we might want to, style in a specific way. So the first thing I want to do, and I'm going to stick in this area because throughout my site, I might have ordered lists, unordered lists in different places. So I'm just going to style lists specifically. And I think anytime I have a list, and we're just talking about the list itself, which is the whole container, I think I want some margin. I don't want it just to like be touching the thing. So I'm going to give it a margin of top of 16 pixels, margin bottom of 16 pixels. And then I'll kind of spread some stuff out a bit. Good. Now, in terms of styling the list items, I do UL space LI. So any list items, any LIs inside of UL. And just to test to make sure this works, let's give it a color of red. Doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Color, what? Abort. What is happening here? What? Let's try something else. Font size 40 pixels. Something funny is happening. Do I know what? Not yet, but oh, I think this happened to me before. And it's mostly because I think I'm like streaming a bunch of stuff. I think my browser's just kind of frozen because I'm noticing it's not refreshing. So I'm going to copy this link, or copy the URL, paste it into here. There we go. Close this tab. I'm not sure why that's happening. So if you're noticing changes not happening, just try and refresh. You should notice like in Chrome, at least a little thing happen here where things go. But if it's frozen up, then just what I did was really reopen it by copying this, putting in a new tab. Okay, so to test this is working, color red. So we know it's working. So one thing I'm kind of getting annoyed with here before we continue on is I'm noticing that, pretty much all the time, when we styled these links, when we styled this, we were changing the font because we're like, we don't like this serif font. And it's just becoming repetitive. And as we add more stuff, we're going to probably be doing that a bunch. So we can actually set some defaults to ourselves that everything will inherit. And I'm going to go to the very top of my document of my page for this, of my CSS file. And I'm going to type the word body. So I'm literally now styling our body tag here, which is this. And I'm just going to say font family serif or sans serif. And when I refresh, you'll see that these became a sans serif as well. And this is still a sans serif, which means I can do a bit of a refactor now. And to do that, I'm going to look for places where I have sans serif. And in VS Code, I can actually go Command F and start searching for sans serif. And I can see I have one in my menu A. So I'm going to erase that because we don't need it anymore. We've already said by default use this font. We should have it in one other place. Yep, on the content P. So let's erase that. Usually in programming in general, when you start seeing patterns like that and you're noticing that you are repeating a lot of things, it's good to sometimes take a step back and be like, okay, where can I optimize this line and do it just in one spot? And after I do that, it's really important to then go and refactor. Otherwise, in the future, you say we didn't refactor, and then we're like, you know what? Let's use monospace everywhere. We would then start to see monospace everywhere, except for those places that we already said sans serif. So it's good to just kind of take a step back sometimes, because it'll save time and energy in the long run, especially if you're coming back to a project that you haven't touched in a while and you don't remember all the pieces of it. So now by default, we'll be using sans serif unless we override it in these couple places where we're saying we want to use that mono font. Okay, so we'll go back to our ULLI. And what I want to do is I'm going to work on its font size because we're using a bigger font size throughout. Let's try 18 pixels. Looking good. Then what I want to do, I want to give it that, those bullets, those bullet points. So on list items, you can do something called list style and type in, let's do disk first. And we'll see that we have these nice disks. That's like, if you don't have a CSS reset, that's the default one that will show up on LIs in most browsers. You can also, I think there's one called circle, and that's kind of like the one without the fill in. But yeah, we'll use disk. But something that's funny here is I feel like these dots should kind of line up with this edge here. So what we're actually going to do on our UL, so we don't have to do on every list item, is we're going to give it a margin left of, and I'm going to guess, and we'll play with it. I'm going to say 20 pixels. And then that moved it over. And aside from me opening up a protractor ruler to find out, I think that looks much better. So we gave a margin left on the UL, and basically that's just shifting over, shifting over the UL, because the bullets actually get applied, to the content as sort of a, I'm going to put it a little bit to the left. So we have to compensate for that by then moving it over. I see a question in the chat about what refactor means. So refactoring is, you've maybe made a decision of how you want to do something. For instance, we started, saying we want to use this font family throughout, and we started to notice that, there's probably, because we're typing this so much, there's probably a better way. And we decided the better way was, let's put it at the body. Let's just say by default, every font will be this, unless we say otherwise. The refactor part of that is partly that, making that decision, but it's also then going through your code and looking for other references that are no longer necessary. And because we've already said we're using sans serif, and in our menu, we were saying use sans serif, and in our paragraphs, we were saying use sans serif, and even in the LIs, we kind of had all this stuff that essentially we could just prune and get rid of. So that was kind of an example of a refactor there. Refactoring happens all the time in programming. You might notice that you have some bottleneck in some thing that you're making, and you need to rethink the way that it works. And that when you do that, you obviously have to make changes to your code, and that doing those changes to something existing is, I guess, probably the definition of a refactor. All right, going back to our LIs, we are going to, I feel like they're kind of, these could be a little bit more spread out. So before we did that with line height. So let's try that again. Line height, because our font size 18, let's use 24 pixels. We'll save, go back, and we get that little bit of nice spreading out here. All right, so we have some hobbies. Let's make another section. And I'm just gonna literally copy and paste this whole thing to save some time and say favorite foods. And for those Americans, yes, I am spelling it the Canadian way. My favorite way. Food 1, food, oh, we have that. Food 3. We will fill this in with real stuff later. Okay, it's coming along. Now, something I'm seeing here is I kind of, this doesn't take up that much room. I mean, there's not much content. I have a couple hobbies here, and even if I added more, like generally, unless my hobby is like, 100 characters long, I'm kind of wasting a lot of space here. I feel like, this could maybe look good as 2 columns. So we're going to play around with a way to do that. I'm going to go back to my HTML. I'm going to move this. I'm just going to shrink this a little bit because we're not going to look at the CSS for a minute. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a new, kind of like a container for these things. And the way I'm going to do it, and there's many different ways to do it, but I'm going to make a div with a class equal to row. And then inside that, I'm going to make a div with a class equal to call. Open that up, and I'm going to copy and paste that guy. So as you can imagine, not that this will do anything yet because we haven't told it what this means. It's our own convention. The idea is like, this is a row and these are columns. So what I want to do then is actually paste in my the thing that I want in my first column, which is basically this whole section, hobbies and my hobbies. And I'm going to copy this guy and paste him into here. Remember, it's always good, especially when your HTML gets long, you want to try and keep this indentation pattern. When you open something, anything underneath it will be one indent in. There's no reason your browser won't complain. It's just more for your purpose, so you know the structure of your document. So if I refresh this, there's going to be no difference because this is just a convention that we're kind of making up right now. But we're gonna say let's do things here. So I'm going to go open my CSS a little bit more, and we kind of have. In fact, our CSS is getting a little bit a little bit long. So let's add some comments to kind of make things helpful. So again, in CSS /*, and I'm going to say global styles. And this is just to help me organize what's where. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to make another thing called header styles. Remember, if you can't remember the comments, well, it is / and then */. But in VS Code, you can do command / to turn on and off comments. So we have our header stuff. And then let's make another one called content styles. And VS Code does a good job at reminding you, oh, look, if I didn't close that, everything else is a comment until I close it. So that, again, they're comments, they're not going to do anything, they don't render, they're just to help us remember where things are. So inside my global styles, I'm actually going to make a new section called layout helpers. Helpers are, it's a convention and a word. Basically, it's where I would put things like stuff to deal with columns and grids and all these kind of things, essentially like reusable things that are going to be throughout your site. And what we're going to do is we're going to style the row. And we're going to say anytime that we have a row, we want to give it a margin top of 15 pixels and a margin bottom of 15 pixels. Just to, anytime we decide we have a new row, we want a little bit of space. Now what we're gonna really style is a column within a row. So that's, we had a row, we have a column. So class, which is the dot of row, space, column, col, C-O-L. You could call these anything. There's no, I use row and col. It's easy to type. They're 3 letters. It's nice, but it still conveys a message. So you know what it means. So what we're going to do with our columns is we're going to make the column width 50%. We're doing this pretty basic. Obviously, we could add and keep adding different stuff to this to have columns when we want to have like 3 in a row. This would essentially be meant for when we have 2. So you're going to get 50-50. If I save that, we're not done yet, but I just want to show what that did. You're going to see that they are now 50%. And I'm going to inspect this just to show. So basically that column is, the row is still the full width, but the column is taking up that much space. Now, if I wanted this to go over here, which is really what I'm intending right now, we need to use something called floating. So by default, everything we've been doing, except for a few elements like links, and there's a few other ones like bold tags, italic, which are considered inline elements, which we talked about earlier this week. Everything in CSS or in HTML and CSS together are by default block elements, meaning when you open a new element, it's basically going to go down to a new line, down to a new line. The structure of a document's very much do. But there are cases, very many, where we want things to kind of be beside each other. So what I want to do with columns is actually tell them to what's called float left. So this is saying any column, I'm going to float left. And what that basically does is it goes and it looks, only if it can, to try and fit in beside its thing, as opposed to below it. And if we refresh now, we'll see, cool, it is. And if we inspect this again, there's not much different, but you'll see the columns are like this. And the only difference is the fact that you see this float left here. Boom, boom, boom. So that's all good. Now, something else I want to do with my columns is actually, I want to give them a bit of padding just on the right-hand side, just so there's kind of like a bit of a gutter between them. So I'm going to say 8 pixels on the right. Now, what happened there? Because we added padding, it's no longer allowed to, there's not enough room for it to fit because that padding got added on after its width. So there's a bunch of different ways to combat this. We're going to go with the simplest approach. And rather than saying a fixed 8 pixels, I'm actually going to do a padding right of 1%. This won't fix it yet, but it's a different way to do it. So the same issue applies. So if we think about this, we're basically saying we want a width of 50% and padding of 1%. So that's 51% per column, which means if we had 2 columns, that's 102% wide. And 102% is more than 100%. So we have to kind of do a bit of math here to be like, okay, if we're saying we're adding 1% to the right, we also need to take off 1% to the width. So 49%, 1%. And then we'll get this nice little thing, because we know that when we add 49 and 1, we have that equals 50. There are definitely other ways to do this. I'm not going to get into them now because I'm trying to like really show the basics, but this solution works quite well. So the reason that basically what you need to make sure is, say you decided this to be 50%, and we didn't have this here, like this worked, but it went right to the edge. And basically what I'm doing is, okay, I want to add 1% of whatever that is, 1% padding, right? So once I add that, I have to remember, okay, if I'm adding 1%, I need to subtract 1% somewhere else. And in this case, I'm subtracting it from here. So 49 plus 1 is 50. So just think of it that way. When you're adding stuff here, you want to. Now, if we were to want to also add padding left to it of 1%, we'd have to think the same way. We need to add, 1 plus 1 is 2. So when this was 50, we'd actually go down to 48. And that'll now make it, centered in here. But I actually prefer it more on the right because it, oops, 49, because I want this to line up with that. So I'm just doing it on the right. Cool, we got some lists. Now I'm going to confuse you guys again, hopefully. So all that seems good, but I want to show you something interesting here. If we inspect this and actually look at the row, look at the height of it. It's 0. The height of the row is 0. It's 1000 wide, but it's 0 tall. Why is that happening? Well, floated elements, anytime you have a floated element inside something, it no longer, it kind of lives in its own world and is no longer going to change the structure of its parent. So to demonstrate that, after we have a row, let's get rid of this for a bit. Oops. I'm going to copy and paste one of my paragraphs again and put it after this closing row. And what you're going to see is, wait, what? That shouldn't have happened. Hey, we fixed it. I wonder why that's happening. All right, never mind. Things are good. Sometimes, and I'm not sure why it's not happening now. Maybe browsers have gotten a little bit better since I've done things this way. A lot of the time, you would actually start to have some overlap here. So you get sort of weird things happening. So the best practice is after you have anytime you're floating things, after you're done, what you actually want to do. Oh, wait. Wait. This is okay. That's closing the row. That's closing the column. Yeah. Okay. So what we want to do to solve, I know you can't see the issue here. I'm not sure why we can't see the issue. It could be. Oh, you know why we probably can't. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So now, okay. Because I think just because they happen to be the same height, we didn't have this issue. But what's kind of happening here is, even though this paragraph is after the row, it's still trying to float everything. Once you start floating something, it's kind of like keep floating things, like make this into 2 columns. Cool. So to combat that, what we have to do is what's called a clear fix. So after our last closing, after our last column, we're going to add a new class. We're going to add a new tag, a new div. I'm going to give it a class of clear. And I'm going to save that. And we're going to go back to our layout helper section. So we had row, we had column. We're also going to do something /.clear. And all we want to do in here is say clear both. And what that means is it's going to stop this floating from happening. So if we were to save both of these things and refresh, you'll see, okay, because we had that clear, that essentially said, okay, that's the end of, I'm done with this whole floating thing. It was fun while it lasted, but we're done. It'll then, your site will continue to render the way you want. So floating has some weird, gotchas with it. And that's one important thing to look for, is making sure you're clearing it. So we added a class called clear, and essentially all we're saying in that class, anytime we have a clear, we're going to clear both, stop it from happening. All right, this is fine. We have a lot of text. I think we should go back. I'm going to make this guy tiny again. remember how we had an image somewhere in here? Here it is. I'm gonna move this guy, and I think you should go between my first two paragraphs. I'm gonna make some space here, put my image, and put it like that. And we're gonna see, cool, there he is. And what I wanna do, I could just style images in my site and say images, I want to do this, I want to be this wide, but this is a very special image. This is kind of like my hero image, as we're going to call it. I don't know where that term came from. I don't know if it's like an agency world word, but I know in a lot of projects I work on, clients always call something the hero image. And it's like, the big one that's like at the top of a page. So we're just going to call it that and ask questions later. So I gave it a class of hero just so we can target it specifically. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this bigger. I'm also going to close that. I realized that shouldn't have been open. It was taking up a lot of space. And we're going to go into our content section. So content styles. And we're going to go dot content and say image, img dot hero. So that's saying any images with the class of hero that are within the content do something different. And let's just make sure that that's working by giving it a border of 2 pixels, red, solid. So it's size, color, and the type of border. And we'll see that didn't do anything. And this is a common mistake, especially when you have 2 files open. What's happening? Well, I didn't save my index.html, and because we made changes here, we need to save that. And we refresh, and there, now we know it's working. I pretty much, and I don't know if it's just like a habit or whatever, but I not only do I save a lot, I generally do these kinds of things. Anytime I add something new, before I start writing like 5 lines, 6 lines of CSS, I like usually do some little debugging where I'm like, let's make sure that I'm targeting the right thing here. Because, if I accidentally was targeting the wrong thing and wrote all this stuff, I might be confused what's going on. So it's just, I do a quick one-liner, something like border or background color or color if it's just text, and, style it. But we don't need that line. Okay, what do I want to do with images? Because this is a hero image, I feel like its width should be 100%. And because CSS is smart and your browser is smart, when I make the width 100%, it also made the height proportional. If I was to give this a specific height of like 100 pixels, it's no longer going to try and automatically figure out things for me, and it's going to stretch it. But because I'm just giving it one of the properties of width or height, it is just going to automatically keep the proportion and not stretch. All right, this is looking okay. It's a big picture. I like rounded corners, so we're going to do that. Now, let me tell you about rounded corners. CSS, I've been making websites before CSS was a thing, and it used to be the biggest pain in the ass, because what you actually had to do was turn your image into 9 different images, where you would actually, in like a photo editing tool, carve out these things. You had to make the background color whatever the background of your website was, so that it would, you're basically just like tricking people to be like, yeah, this thing is rounded corners. But in CSS, we can just do border, radius, and give it a pixel amount. So I'm going to say 8 pixels. It's hard to visualize what that means, but it's essentially like, you can imagine a circle being placed here that's 8 pixels wide, that's then curving it. And because I'm streaming this, I'm going to make it really big for a minute just to show, but it's basically adding in, this nice sort of thing here. Actually, I kind of like it big, maybe not that big, but let's do 16 for now. For border radius, there's other things you can do too. You can actually do percentages, and that's generally used when you want to make a full circle. So I can go border radius 50%, and it'll actually make it, well, an oval in this case, because the image isn't square. It's basically saying, okay, 50% of the width, 50% of the height, which thus, turns it into a circle. So that's really, that's usually what's used in like people's profile pictures on social networks. It'll be like a border radius 50%, and it just makes it the circle, whereas the actual source image is still big. It's still a square or a rectangle. Okay, so we have that happening. That looks good. Let's give it a little bit of a border. And in this case, I'm going to make it 2 pixels solid. And let's start with I'm just going to type black just to make sure it works. So it gave us this thing that is, too dark for me. So what we're going to do, rather than like using a color picker, we're going to, I want to make this like a pretty light gray. And I could get a color picker and I could go and that's all good. But we're going to do something that we talked about earlier this week, which is the RGB A pattern. So we'll start by just RGB, just to give an example of how it works. So, sorry, I can do, instead of writing a hex code, I can do RGB and then parentheses. And I can say, I basically am going to be putting in the amount of red, the amount of green, and the amount of blue. This goes from a scale of 0 to 255. So if I did 255, 0, 0, and they're separated by commas. And if I refresh, you'll see it's red. If I change this to 255 and went back to 0, we would see green. And blue would be the next one. 0, 0, 0 means, no color, so it's going to be black. Whereas 255, 255, 255 would be full white. And there's 16.7 million combinations of those numbers you could do. Now, the reason I want to use this is actually because I want to throw in a fourth parameter. So you can do RGB, and that's all good, but there's also RGBA. And that accepts a fourth parameter of alpha, which is basically like the amount of how opaque something is, how transparent it is. So if I was to put a 1 here, and so those were all 255 out of 255 out of 255. The last parameter is between 0 and 1, and it's like a decimal. So you could do 0, you could do 1, or you could do 0.2234, whatever you want. If I put it at 1, it's not going to make any difference because I'm saying it's fully opaque, but I want this to be slightly transparent. So if I did 0.5, we're actually going to see it rendered kind of as a gray. And what's actually happening, why it's gray in this case, is we're basically blending, 50% black with the white underneath. To demonstrate this, if I was to change my background color of my whole body to background color yellow, it's going to look a little bit different. It's kind of, let's go to like, 0.2%, and I'll make it even wider just for the purposes to demonstrate this. You'll see it's not actually gray. It's a 20% black on top of yellow, which then, kind of comes to this dark, it basically like darkens the background underneath it. So let's get rid of that ugly yellow and go back, and let's just make this, I just wanted to kind of like a subtle, instead of 10 pixels, let's just make it 1 pixel. Just give it this like sort of subtle little thing here. No, I like 2 pixels more. There we go, and I think we can go with 0.3. Yeah, just kind of adds, just to show the difference. It is subtle, but it kind of just adds this bit of a hard edge around it, like that. Okay, I also want my photo to kind of pop a little bit more. So let's have some fun here. We're going to give something what's called box shadow. And box shadow, and I usually pretty much always have to Google this, so don't feel like, in general, never feel like you have to memorize all these things. Your IDE is going to help the editor that you're using, as well as Googling. I can just go CSS box shadow like that, and I can click on the Mozilla one's pretty good. W3 Schools is probably it's probably the best resource when you're really starting out, because it is really simple, and it will tell you things like, okay, box shadow 5 pixels, 10 pixels. 5 pixels, 10 pixels, and then it will kind of tell you this. This isn't super helpful because I'm like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, if you scroll down here, you actually start to see the values. So the first parameter is basically how much of a horizontal offset is there, how much of a vertical offset, how much blur. So this is a good resource, W3 Schools, for for basic stuff. So what I am going to do is I'm going to say I want a horizontal offset of 2 pixels and a vertical offset of 2 pixels and a color, just a test of red. Oh, sorry, there's one more parameter. Let's see, I forget. So blur is the next one, yeah, and then color. So I want a blur of 5 pixels, and we'll demonstrate all these mean. So what that kind of doing is it's saying I want a shadow around this box. 2 pixels over, 2 pixels down, and to show the difference between that, I'm going to make these 12. So that's like how much it's being offset, but 2 is a little bit better. 5 pixels is how much it's blurring. So if I say that's a 0, you'll see it's just like a hard edge. And example that, so hard edge, that doesn't look too bad. But yeah, I think we want a bit of blur, even just like 4 pixels, maybe even more. Let's make it more, 10 pixels. So there, it's giving us this nice blur. And let's play with the color. So, black, it's gonna look like that. This looks like an awful PowerPoint presentation. But we're gonna do that same thing that we did before with the RGBA and actually do 000.2. So we're gonna make it really light. So it's just this really subtle thing. And I'm gonna set it back to maybe like offset of 3. So yeah, and it just kind of like adds this nice little, makes your website feel like it has a bit of 3 dimensions to it. And it's really subtle. Like, you can probably see it now because you've been watching me do it. But if I was to turn it off, like, it's not the biggest, not the biggest difference in the world. It's just this like subtle little thing. In fact, we could probably get away with 0.1 and it still is going to make an impact, that compared to that. But like, if you were looking at this, I don't think you look at this, you don't look at it consciously like, oh, there's, a bit of a, thing here. But it does subconsciously give some depth to your site. You definitely don't want to overuse this. Like, you could add this to text. We could globally like add it to the buttons. They could be everywhere. I feel like too much shadow, I'm not a designer, but it starts to look ugly. I mean, I know it looks like I'm a designer because this site is amazing. Okay, so we got that. Since we only have a few minutes, so rather than trying to build more content, let's play with this photo a little bit more. These are sort of more fun things. So what I'm going to do is, and this is since CSS 3, something called CSS Filters. And we can actually go and type the word filter. And we can do things like saturation or saturate, sorry. This basically allows us to say how much we want to saturate it. By default, it's going to be 1, which is whatever the image is. But we could put a 0 in here. And that's going to make it black and white. That's nice. We could also add a bigger number, like 5. And we're actually going to see, it's super saturated. Saturation is basically how much color do we want to show. So it starts to look really bad. But let's put that back to 1 for now. Because what I want to kind of do is I want the images to sort of have like a hover effect on them. So we've done this before, but I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to add that pseudo class of hover, which is a colon and then hover. And I'm going to copy what I did here and put it in here. So basically what I want to say is on hover, saturate to 1. But when you're not hovering, I'm going to make it saturate of 0. So what we're going to see is it's black and white, but when you actually mouse over it, the color gets added. I know this photo is probably not the best example of that because it already doesn't have a ton of color. You can kind of see what's happening, but it's nice. It adds this little effect. Now, what we could also do, similar to what we did with the links, is give it a transition. So I can do transition, and I can choose filter as the property, so any filtering, and I want to do over 0.4 seconds. So now when you refresh, it's actually a bit of a transition. And to like really emphasize that, let's oversaturate it so it comes through better. You'll see it kind of like transitions over almost half a second. So that's nice. Now UX-wise, this might be a bit misleading because a lot of the times when something happens on hover, you're expecting, users are going to be expecting it to be clickable. But I just wanted to kind of demo this, and who knows, maybe we will make it clickable at some point. All right, so I'm going to leave it like that. And yeah, we're going to continue tomorrow, finishing up this web page. In fact, I feel like this web page is maybe a couple things we do over 10 minutes is pretty much good. What we're actually going to do is figure out how to create another page and then make them link to each other. So yeah, I'll see you guys all tomorrow. Thanks for joining. I'm going to paste the YouTube link in the chat right now, just so people have it in case they want to rewatch and follow along. So just bear with me for 1 sec before I end the stream. Where do I find that again? Oh yeah, wait, there's a link in it in Zoom. Yay, copy streaming link. Okay, I'm putting this in to everyone. So that's the link if you want to rewatch it. All right, so happy making your cat websites, and you guys have a nice rest of your day. Bye for now.